Retirement fund administration is not rocket science. In the life of a fund, I think there's a couple of important points, obviously at the beginning when you create a fund, but then there's also some inflection points along the way. Typically, one would be when you change service providers, like, for example, administrators. And then another one, and this is one that's coming up in the very near future, early next year, is the introduction of the new two-pot or two-component system, as I believe they refer to it now. And that is something that comes from a legislation side. And it's introducing a lot of complexity in the administration environment. We've had some systems experts that I've spoken to that are expressing concerns about the ability of administrators to be able to handle this. And this creates a bit of a problem area, because what happens if things go wrong? And I'm joined this morning by Vaidah Chipadza, who's the divisional head at the Fiduciary section at Camargue Underwriting Managers, to talk about the what can go wrong and what should one do as a board of trustees, to be able to mitigate some of those risks. Vaidah, good morning.
Morning, Chris. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And good day to all our viewers. So today, as I start, I think I'll just give a brief overview of what a trustee's liability policy covers. So in a nutshell, it covers losses caused to the fund by an officer. And the definition of an officer is quite wide. It includes the principal officers, the trustees, any employees of the fund, and any members of the board of the fund. But it does not include the likes of the auditors and valuators, and I will explain on that as we go further with this presentation. So the purpose of a pension fund is therefore to ensure that there is enough fund to cover pensions of employees after retirement or in the event of their death, then to beneficiaries. So trustees and the officers of the fund therefore play a critical role to ensure that this objective is met. But sometimes things can go wrong, as Chris was saying. Sometimes things can go wrong, and the fund officers can be held personally liable in their personal capacity. And this is then when the pension funds trustees become useful. Just a comparison in terms of the trustees' liability and maybe the directors and officers and how they run the company, just for us to get a view of the complexities of the running of a pension fund. You realize that with directors, they play a critical role in the running of the company, the overall oversight, the strategic direction of the company. The directors are responsible for that. Same with the trustees, they are responsible for the overall oversight of a pension fund and how it runs. And when you look at directors as well, you note that directors, when they are appointed, they have the qualifications mostly, they have the expertise, they have the experience. But for the pension funds, the Pension Fund Act just requires that a fund just have to have a minimum of 4 trustees, 50% of whom must be employees selected. That on its own therefore poses a risk in terms of the employees selected. Do they have the experience? Do they have the qualifications? And do they have the expertise to run a pension fund? Another thing that you also note, normally directors are involved in the day-to-day running of the company. They are there, they are involved. They are involved in the day-to-day running. But when you look at pension funds trustees or pension funds themselves, we know that board of trustees many a time have different service level, different service providers that assist them in terms of the running of the fund. That on its own then has its own complications, because a pension fund or on its own, a pension fund will have then the different service providers. That examples could include the investment managers, the administrators, actuaries, and auditors who assist them in terms of the running of the fund. But that does not absolve the trustees from liability should anything go wrong from the part of the third part service providers. Therefore, it's important for pension funds or boards of pension funds to ensure that the service level agreements are watertight as far as the agreements they have with their service providers. A case in point that comes to mind when we look at this matter was a case at the pension fund adjudicator against the board of trustees, an actuary, and an administrator. In this case, the actuary was responsible for the calculation of the monthly unit prices for the fund in terms of the investments. And there was an error in terms of the calculation, in the sense that a same opening balance was used for 4 consecutive months. And this led to overpayments of benefits to beneficiaries that received their benefits during that period, as well as members that transferred to other funds. And it resulted in a loss of about 40 billion. Looking at this, you realize that board of trustees were called to question as well, in the sense that, as I said earlier, they have the overall oversight in the running of the fund, despite the fact that they don't have the expertise, they don't have the experience many a time, this in terms of an actuary's responsibility, but they were still called to task in this case. The actuary as well was called to task, and the administrator as well was called to task, mainly because the administrator, they keep the details of for the fund, they make payments on the fund's behalf. So there's a lot that the administrator is involved in. And an interesting thing is that the administrator actually said, yes, we were aware that the opening balance was the same for 4 consecutive months. But according to our service level agreement, this is not something that we are supposed to report on and to be worried about. So you note that then the service level agreements with service providers becomes very important. Another thing as well that you note is that this loss was for about 40 million. And when you look at the average limits or average limits of indemnity that most funds buy, you know that most of them buy within the 5 million sum insured band. That in its own might pose a big risk, especially for funds that have got assets and liabilities that are in their millions and in their billions. If you take the bare minimum and there is a claim for 40 million in this case, and in any way the trustees are found to be lacking in any way, you realize that trustees will then end up forking from their own personal pocket. Therefore, it's very important that they look at the limit of indemnity and ensure that they have the correct or they have the adequate cover in place. Now going back to the two-pot system that Chris spoke about and its effect on trustees' liability. With the two-pot system, it's simply a system that will come into place sometime next year, where then you have sort of 3 pots as a member of a pension fund. You have a fund where a retirement pot to which 2/3 of your contributions will be allocated, and then those contributions should grow and must be preserved until the member retires. Then there is also a second pot, which is the savings pot, to which up to 1/3 of the contributions can be allocated, and members can have access to these savings without having to resign from their jobs. And then there's also the vested pot, which houses the retirement savings a member has accumulated before the two-pot system is implemented. And this will be subject to the current rules of the fund. Looking at all this, you can see that there is some complications in terms of how this will be administered. And the first thing that trustees have to look at is that they have to understand how this will impact their fund and determine how they will proceed going forward. There are challenges in terms of trustees where they have to look at setting and refining their investment strategies to accommodate the two-pot systems. On its own, the two-pot system does come with its different challenges and its different complexities. So we are looking at your investment strategies, how they are going to refine that. Not only that, but they are also looking at their service level providers, at their service providers. Do they have the systems? Do they have the capacity? As I touched earlier on, the fact that there is an administrator in place does not absolve them from liability. So they have to make sure that they have the right systems, they have the capacity to cater for the multiple records that the two-pot system will come with. Not only that, but you realize that changes in legislation such as this also poses as well, more risks for the Board of Trustees. So they have to look at, are we adequately covered in terms of the limit of indemnity? Is it adequate? Do we need to increase, and how do we, and by how much? So all these are risks that the two-pot system will pose to the Board of Trustees. But as Camargue, you know that in addition, we do offer trustees liability. We do write that on our site, but you know that in addition to the liability cover that we offer, there's also risk management services that are readily available to all our clients at no additional cost to them. So there's not only the trustees liability cover, but there's also the risk management services, which I think will be very critical in terms of the Board of Trustees to make use of, especially with the complexities of the two-post system. So some of the risk management services that we do offer as Camargue include the private arbitration services. There's also includes the cyber vulnerability scan. This is also very crucial, especially when we look at the levels of cyber crime at this point in time, especially in South Africa, being ranked at the top, especially in Africa. So it's very important that trustees then make use of this. There's also crisis communication and public relations. This is also very important. You note that at this in the environment that we are operating in, it's very easy for things to spiral out of control through social media, through communication. It's very easy to access communication, communication and to speak your mind on different platforms. So it's very important to have this risk management service provider, because the risk manager then comes in, helps you in terms of responding and helps you to manage that crisis. There's also in terms of specifically for pension funds trustees, there's also account verification in terms of large payments. As I touched earlier on, there's a lot of cyber crime, there's a lot of interception in terms of payments. So there's account verification is very important, especially for large payments. Then there's also pension fund and complementary pension fund adjudicator response to the per policy period. So you get that one per policy period. There's also high-level analysis of the pension fund in order to highlight any areas of potential risk. That's also an important one. Any areas of potential risk, there's a high-level analysis to determine whether there's any areas that you need to improve on. There's also high-level analysis of pension fund service level agreements. That's something that I have touched on throughout this presentation. Service level agreements are critical, and it's important that you get an expert who looks into them to highlight any areas of potential risks and how you can improve on them. So that's another important one. There's also training. As I said earlier on, sometimes the expertise and the changes are just too much that it might be difficult to cope with them. But then you have the training with our risk management service providers to train on your responsibilities, and especially these changes that are coming. What can the Board of Trustees do? How can they improve on that? So all of those are very important and are critical in terms of the running of the fund. So in terms of our risk management services, is there to manage, to migrate and to mitigate risk, which is very important. Sometimes we don't need to wait for a claim. We need to be there to manage the risk before the claims come into play. That's basically what we offer as Camargue. I'll hand it over back to Chris.
Thank you, Vaidah. That was very comprehensive. I made the opening statement to say, pension funds are not rocket science. But having listened to you, it's not easy to be a board, a trustee member. And I'm not sure if all trustees and principal officers realize how big that responsibility is, especially in the next couple of months, as people start realizing, not all is as good as they think it is. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. And I certainly look forward to continuing this conversation with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.